Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and tonight I have an excellent interview lined up with Dr. James Pfaus. He received his PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the University of British Columbia in 1990, and after postdoctoral training in molecular biology and behavior at the Rockefeller University in New York City, he joined the Center for Studies in Behavioral Neurobiology Department of Psychology at Concordia University in Montreal, where he is currently a professor of neuroscience and psychology and a university research fellow. His research is generally concerned with the neurochemical and molecular events that subserve sexual behavior and neuroendocrine functions. And I will stop there with your bio because it is very impressive and very in detail. And I'm sure most of us would get lost. But the basis is that you know your stuff, and we're here to talk about female sexual desire and disorders as they are classified in the diagnostic manuals and what women can learn about and expect as they interact with both the medical and therapeutic fields in regards to these issues. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So glad you're here. Anything you'd like to add as far as your introduction, and tell us a little bit more about yourself or how you got interested in this field to begin with?
Oh, well, who's not interested in sex? I mean, everyone is, regardless of their background. That's part of what keeps the human race going, I think, is our prurient interests in sex, whether they be for reproduction or whether they be for pleasure. So, for me, that was really the top of the hierarchy. And if you want to understand motivation and brain evolution and what are those external, events that make us change our behavior, make us change and want and desire and live and love to live, sex really is the top of that hierarchy. And for me, that was always an interest. I can't really think of a time I can't go back far enough to think of a time that I didn't think in some way or another about sex, right? So trying to understand how it works, why it works, how the brain is kind of organized for it. I remember being a teenager, and looking up and finding Masters and Johnson and kind of slogging through that and thinking, wow, this is really cool, but how does it work? And really nobody knew. In the 1970s, nobody had a clue how anything worked other than maybe some beginning to understand actions of steroid hormones. But really, there was no idea of what neurotransmitters were activated, why it felt good, why do orgasms feel good, why does arousal feel so compelling, why does desire feel so compelling. There was absolutely no answer to it. So I kind of went to grad school thinking I'm going to try to answer a few of those questions. And, sure enough, that's exactly what happened.
Would you like to talk a little bit about some of the information that we do now know that we didn't know in the 70s? Is that a worthwhile question, or is that too
sure.
vague?
I think it gets at the heart of what really is meant by desire relative to arousal, relative to pleasure. One of the first things I kind of was interested in looking at was, do orgasms involve opioid actions in the brain? These are molecules that are endogenous neurotransmitters, but the action of morphine and the action of heroin, for example, in the brain, are mimicking the action of your own opioids. So when there's a rush of euphoria that you might get when you smell the head of your newborn baby, when you are presented with your favorite meal, when you hear music that gives you chills, all of these things involve the activation of opioids in the brain. And those are very important compounds. They activate parts of your emotional brain and parts of the regulatory system, even parts of your cortex. And essentially they reinforce what you're doing and make you think that what you're doing feels good and feels pleasurable. And anytime there's pleasure, there's opioids involved. The other thing we also learned from my PhD research on dopamine and sexual behavior was that the dopamine system is not reward per se, but it drives your attention and all the movements you make toward things that you find rewarding. So how do you go and get it? Right? What's the proper thing to say at a bar? How do you negotiate sex when you've been married for 20 years? What do you do to make it arousing, to make it interesting, to make it, the kind of thing that it was when you were first dating? All of that involves the action of dopamine in very specific parts of the emotional brain and parts of the regulatory brain that are themselves sensitized by the action of opioids. And one of the things we discovered from this, the brain really is, how can I put it? It's kind of evolved in a way, even in rats, to be fomenting circular reasoning. That which makes you feel good feels good to move towards. And you think about it, potentially you could have probably really great sex with probably at least 100 people who live within a 10-mile radius of you, but you're not going to go after them because they don't fit the bill. They're not hot. You don't find them arousing. You don't find their features delightful and something you actually want to go towards. And even in rats who are allegedly promiscuous, very simple Pavlovian conditioning, when they have really good sex with one and only one partner, makes them choose to have sex with the same partner or with a partner who has some resemblance to the original partner. I find that really interesting because everybody has a type. Some people like blonde, some people like brunette, some people like big, some people like small, some people like fat and skinny and whatever. I mean, you can put an amalgamation all together. And in a way, that's one of the things that's actually kept our species and kept all species alive, is that you're not really kind of replicating along the same lines, but you're actually sexually reproducing and outbreeding all of your good stuff into other animals and other members of your species. So diversity is what keeps things going. So it keeps your immune system going. It's what keeps our gene pool going. And I think one of the ways that works is that it's kind of almost random who we end up with. Other than the fact that they have features that we find very, very hot and very attractive, and what's happening is your first good experiences are activating opioids, activating oxytocin, which is really in a way sensitized by opioids as well, and linking that to dopamine. So these big three, it's not that the brain only consists of three, it has many, and a lot of support staff in a way, but those big three are the ones that make you identify potential partners, make you move towards those potential partners, and make you interact with them in such a way that you're going to be successful as opposed to rejected.
Never thought of diversity as such a sexy concept before, so that's fun. Not to tangent too much, but you're talking about these chemicals and opioids, and there's a lot of talk about how sex can be like a drug, and this is a concept I've kind of done a lot of fighting against, this idea of addiction to sexuality. So could you give us just a very quick concept of, even though you're talking about these chemicals and how they interact, how that's not necessarily replicating what substances might do to the brain?
Well, no, one of the big problems with thinking of sex as an addiction, for example, is the idea that drugs get in and they take over the system and they activate it in a very prolonged way that your own neurotransmitters don't do. Your neurotransmitters are, not that they have short actions, but if you think of what an orgasm feels like, it's over. That euphoric opioid effect is over in a matter of seconds. If you were to do an injection of heroin, you'd have that euphoria, but it would last several hours. And yes, you drift into sleep, you drift in and out, but when you're out of sleep, you're in that euphoria again. And so you're constantly wafting back from sleep into euphoria, back from sleep into euphoria. I think that's a very, very different animal. And in fact, the way your brain's neurochemical systems react to that is they tolerate to it. And they tolerate to it in a way that makes you want more and more. Now, of course, people look at that and say, but see, that's what happens with these sex addicts. They just want more and more. Well, certainly part of addiction is obsessive compulsive behavior. And certainly people can be obsessive compulsive, especially if they feel guilty about it, about sex. We tend to be most obsessive about the things, that are the most guilty pleasures that we have. So I think that it's not addiction because when you take yourself away from it, there's no withdrawal. Heroin addicts, for example, experience intense withdrawal that makes them kind of wish they were dead. That doesn't happen here. Cocaine addicts experience intense withdrawal, and the withdrawal, of course, is hyper in the opposite direction. So they get insanely sluggish, right, and just can't function, and there's no amount of coffee can take them out of that. So there's a lot to this, along with the craving. Now you can say, well, you can crave your child, you can crave, sniffing the head of your newborn baby, you can crave your favorite food. You want it, you like it, but it's not life or death. I mean, if you don't get it because the restaurant's closed or, the music's not on rotation anymore and you don't know where you left the CD, whatever it is, you're going to acclimate to that really quickly. And, these guys that are, sort of chronic masturbators are out there trying to be obsessive with it, trying to crank off 3 a day, whatever it might be. But you tell them to lay off for 48 hours, and guess what? Their sex drive comes back, their erections come back, everything comes back, because they're no longer in a chronic state of refractoriness, which is kind of the problem here. But it's very different because it's not taking over your system. All behavior has a beginning and a middle and an end. And the end activates natural inhibitory systems like serotonin, for example, that come online and make you feel good, give you a sense of satiety. Like, when you've eaten a big meal, how do you know you're done? You're just done. If you eat one more bite, you're going to throw up. You know that you feel really good, and you're right at that point, that juncture where any more of it is going to be aversive. That's a natural thing. I mean, in sex, for example, clitoral induced orgasm and even penile induced orgasm, if somebody keeps on massaging and stroking the clitoris or the penis after orgasm, it gets incredibly aversive. That's how you know it's done. I mean, it's news to some guys. It seems like rocket science. It's like, well, no, I thought you'd want me to keep on stimulating because then you'd have another one. And it's like, no, I'm done. Stop.
Right.
And you just have to learn that, oh yeah, that's like me. I mean, if you kept on doing it, it would not feel good. That's very different from drugs of abuse. You keep on doing it. As long as you can do more and more and more, it's going to feel just as good as it did the first time. So it's a very different beast, I think.
Yeah. No, thank you for that explanation. That's great. So back to the topic of sexual arousal and interest disorders. Let's talk a little bit about this because we just had a new statistical manual in the mental health profession come out. Was it 2 or 3 years ago now? And there were some changes around this. There used to be this general category called hypoactive sexual desire disorder. And now that has changed in the DSM-5. There's female sexual interest arousal disorder, and there's male hypoactive sexual desire disorder. And since we have a lot of women, that's a fairly big complaint, is coming in with libido issues and low desire. I really want to help them understand, first of all, some of the language that we use in the mental health profession, and then we can get into maybe the criteria
Sure.
and how they would even get diagnosed with something like that.
So, I mean, back in the day when DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the first incarnation of it came out, women who were hypersexual, quote unquote, were seen as, absolute having hypersexuality. Those that had none had a desire disorder. And then that became hypo desire disorder. And then it became hyposexual desire disorder. And it was distinct from disorders of arousal, of vaginal lubrication, of getting blood engorged in the clitoris and labia and vagina. And the reason for that was because people were presenting with not one, largely with one or the other. Some had both. I mean, women after menopause, for example, are much more likely to have a sexual arousal disorder than women before menopause. But typically when it comes in twos after menopause. So you've lost your desire and you've lost your arousal. It's very easily reestablished with, estrogen and testosterone therapy. Some women shy away from that because they may have a family history of estrogen-inducible tumors. So there's a way to tighter the dose so that isn't going to happen. But it's it still is kind of scary for women to take that plunge, right? But what's interesting is the premenopausals, because most of them have one or the other. That is, they may have no desire, but if they get clitoral stimulation, nipple stimulation, somebody spends, a good long time, not 2.5 seconds, doing more than just kissing, but actually stimulating and teasing and all sorts of things, dating, whatever it might be, yeah, the arousal will come. The arousal's there. And, some of those women can even have orgasms. But it's just like as soon as they have it, it goes away. The desire to have it again just isn't there. And again, that's quite distinct from somebody who has desire but has a blood flow problem, which could be for any number of reasons. They could be diabetic, they could be, smoking and clogging arteries. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why you might get a lack of blood going into the genital tissues. And I mean, we've seen this, of course, from studies in men. I mean, diabetic men are way more likely to have erectile dysfunction. So we have drugs that affect the periphery for men, Viagra. The ones that would be much more sort of top down and related to either, they just don't have an interest in sex. It's hard to find men who will admit to that, because I think in our culture, men have to be always at attention. And certainly male desire is simply assumed. And I think it's interesting that a desire disorder in men has always been there, but it's very few and far in between who meet that criterion. Not that it doesn't exist, because clearly it does, and more men are showing evidence of this. But I think the arousal problems have always been for men, so they turn to women. They say, okay, women have the same thing, and that's all fine and good. And all the incarnations of the DSM since the first one, which used the word frigidity for women because they were cold to the touch. I mean, everything since then, up to DSM-5, has always acknowledged that women can have a desire disorder distinct from an arousal disorder. But DSM-5 merged the two, and they did that largely for political reasons, not for empirical science, or reasons that were supported by empirical science. I've heard people say, well, sexual interest disorder puts the onus off of the woman and onto her partner as not being of sufficient quality anymore to garner her interest. Well, if that's true, why is it a disorder? Right? I mean, he needs to try harder. So it's not really a disorder if they're fighting all the time and he doesn't listen to her and he's, off doing his own thing. And yet they're claiming that it is, and adding the arousal to it simply means that it's going to be almost impossible to find a drug treatment that affects both. And part of putting it together was driven by a political movement that's out there that is really kind of anti-big pharma. They think big pharma created the whole idea of hypoactive desire in order to sell drugs to women and make women feel bad about their bodies and about themselves and about their sexuality, so that they can go out and buy the drug and feel good about themselves and their bodies and their sexuality. But honestly, I mean, hypoactive desire has been in the DSM since the 1960s, before any drug company would touch it with a 10-foot pole. So it's not that the drug companies invented it, and that meme is out there, unfortunately. It's that drug companies were very happy to attack the penis because men can be in control of their penis. They really didn't want to go after hypoactive desire in women, because then who's in control of it? I mean, do we let women be in control of it? Or do we act very paternalistically, like we have been acting for the last several thousand years with our women, and have it in the purvey of their partners? So on the one hand, I understand, the fear that there's going to be yet another thing to make women feel crappy about themselves, but that fear really doesn't accurately describe what the attempts by certain pharmaceutical companies, and we're not talking big pharma here, we're talking little pharma, we're talking little biotech companies that have come out with these drugs. I mean, Boehringer Ingelheim, that came out with flibanserin, which we know now is Addyi, which was last year was okayed by the FDA. They're a big company, but they're not a publicly traded company, they're a completely private company. And they spent over $2 billion of their own dollars doing some of the best clinical research ever done on sexual desire disorders. And when the FDA said no the first time, the Boehringer brothers, who kind of never really were comfortable with the whole idea of doing this, just dropped the drug. They said, okay, no more, no more. And some people in that company formed another company called Sprout, which ended up getting the drug from Boehringer. So you'd think if Boehringer was really interested in subjugating women, they would have kept it up.
Or making
But of course,
tons of money.
right? And made tons of money off of it, right? But, the FDA imposed enormous controls over this, right? So you have to promise not to drink because there is syncope that might happen, at least early on. So if you're fainting, so if you take the drug and you drink, you might faint. The way they did those studies, interestingly enough, was they made men drink the equivalent of a 6-pack of beer on an empty stomach the first thing in the morning, and then take flibanserin. And yeah, some guys fainted when that happened. I mean, but the prospect of that syncope is actually less than the prospect of syncope from taking, for example, an antihistamine. So you read the warning label, so don't drink and take the antihistamine, and if you do, don't operate heavy machinery. Well, yeah, because if you faint, that would be a bad thing. So when Viagra came out, it's almost like the floodgates were opened. Anybody could get it. Oh, take as much as you want. But for women, we still have this idea that they need to be protected against themselves, that they're not going to understand how to do something. They're not going to understand how to integrate something like this into their lives and into the therapy that they're getting. Right? I mean, I think it's interesting that there's sort of a therapy industry out there that I think this whole idea scares them, that there could be a drug that might work and might propel the therapy forward, where the therapeutic intervention may be no better than sort of the placebo controls were in the actual drug trials. And there's actually some data now published to support that idea. So, I mean, it's interesting. Like, why not have what a woman wants? Like, why not listen to a woman's voice saying, I want my desire back? So instead, the DSM puts the two together. And of course, if you have a drug that affects desire but doesn't affect arousal, well, thanks for playing. That one's not going to be considered because it can't affect both. I mean, it was a very, very interesting strategy on the part of the DSM to do that. What I find interesting is that the European version of this, which is called the ICD, is going into its 11th edition next year. Like the DSM, it was aiming to be an entirely empirical, of course, sort of experimentally derived, with good empirical science and background for everything that it would propose, for all the different labels that it would propose. And they've actually decided to keep hypoactive sexual desire disorder distinct from arousal disorders. So it's not going to link up with the DSM. I mean, the hope was always that North America and Europe would be linked together with sort of a common diagnostic and statistical manual. But the ICD has rejected the idea of putting the two together. And again, it's all about codes, right? It's all about insurance companies and codes, and can you bill people for X, Y, and Z? Well, the insurance companies will have 2 codes instead of 1, which actually doesn't, it doesn't cost them a penny to bill for one versus the other, right? And it's just that if you would have one or the other, as opposed to always having to have both. And of course, then if you don't have both, what happens to the diagnosis? Right? I mean, that's a big issue. I mean, how many women are not going to be treated for anything, not going to receive a code, not get any kind of Medicare coverage for something because they just don't have both? Right? So, I mean, the DSM kind of created a conundrum here that I think the ICD is not going to follow in its footsteps.
To recap, the sexual interest disorder would be how much I want to have sex. And the sexual arousal disorder is really how my body responds to whether or not I want to have sex. So
exactly.
You can have high desire and yet your body isn't responding. Or you can have no desire and probably at the same time that's going to go along with the arousal disorder as well.
Usually, but I mean, when I say usually, it's always a matter of degree. I mean, some women may be slow to be aroused, but if somebody works hard enough at getting them aroused, they can easily get aroused. Take it to its most extreme. Women who are raped, a lot of them have, as part of that experience, not only an experience of vaginal lubrication, but an experience of orgasm.
Right.
And I mean, I can't even imagine what that would be like, but that's got to be one of the most insidious things you can ever experience. I mean, it's almost like your body is sort of betraying you in favor of the rapist. And what I find interesting about that is that your body reacts irrespective of your brain. I mean, yes, the brain and the body, of course, are always intertwined, but here the body reacts in such a way to actually be protective. And vaginal lubrication actually protects the mucosal lining of the vagina, which is probably the largest opening to the bloodstream that any body has. Your intestinal lining is bigger, but that's really not open to the external world. The vaginal mucosa is. And the mucosa is a mucous membrane that covers blood vessels, big blood vessels. So you want that, just like you want it in your nose when you have a cold and your nose gets all stuffed up, so that more things won't get in, so that your immune system can fight what is in there. Vaginal lubrication may not be an unambiguous sexual arousal response, but it may be a general arousal response that actually helps protect the vagina and the blood lining of the vagina so that it doesn't get torn during some kind of, horrible intromissive activity. So there's that.
That's
There's also,
actually, I think, really
right?
helpful for assault victims to maybe be able to reframe it that way, that it was
Oh,
a
I think it's
protective. Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people agree that that's what it is, right? Because, again, women also are kind of, well, from a male perspective, strange when it comes to vaginal engorgement and clitoral and labial engorgement, because yeah, you can show a heterosexual woman heterosexual porn and she'll get vaginally aroused and clitorally and labially aroused. You can show her homosexual porn and she'll get aroused. You can show her bonobos having sex and she'll get aroused. You can even show her, as we discovered when I was in grad school, photos of penguins in Antarctica and you will get vaginal engorgement.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's almost as if there's, the term in parlance now is fluidity, that there's fluidity in women, much more so than in men, where many things, and some of which aren't even sexual, can produce genital arousal.
Hmm.
So if that's true, it probably stems from an evolutionary history where, we just haven't been nice to our women. So if you're going to take one for the team by going over to the other tribe and basically being gangbanged by the king's family, well, guess what? It's probably a really good idea to protect yourself.
Hmm.
And so it may be a more of a stress response. You got good stress, eustress, you got bad stress, distress, but it's a generalized stress response. So it's good when it's wanted, it's bad when it's distressful, but you still get vaginal engorgement either way.
Right, and that's
So,
different than from desire. So your
exactly.
arousal is a very different thing than actually wanting to participate in whatever is arousing.
Exactly right. So, I mean, I think keeping them separate and giving them two different codes is, because then you can have both. You don't have to have one or the other. You can have both. I mean, why not? So, forcing them to be together, I think, is going to decrease the number of women who actually get the diagnosis. And that means there's going to be a whole bunch of women out there who are just not going to be able to be helped by people who are trained under the rubric of the DSM-5. And I find that to be a terrible prospect.
Well, and that's interesting. I mean, I grew up in a family of psychiatrists and mental health professionals. So I had a fairly positive experience of those two professions getting along and seeing each other as helpful in collaboration. And as I entered my training as a marriage and family therapist, that wasn't always the case. It always seemed a little bit more. I mean, we studied the DSM, of course, and it was part of our curriculum. But there seemed to be almost like a distrust or a wanting to get away from pathologizing people.
Right.
And I've noticed that in other mental health professions as well. And so when you talk about this maybe tension between therapists and their ability to be pro medicine, that is an interesting tension that I notice in a lot of the conferences I go to, some of the literature I read, and now what you're saying.
Well, Natasha, I agree that I think it's a pretty recent phenomenon. I mean, recent being relative, of course, but I mean, I can remember a time when psychiatrists and psychologists used to work together, and they would do what they would both agree would be in the best interest of a quote unquote patient. Now patients are clients, right? So clients are people that pay for goods and services. And I think there's a very different idea about them as needy individuals as opposed to them as consumers of things. And I'm not exactly sure when that came into parlance, but I find it interesting that when they're consumers of things, then psychiatrists and psychologists and sex therapists who might have a master's of social work individual, whatever, now are like competing companies rather than holistic family medical practitioners, who are kind of taking the whole body, the whole brain, the whole person, top to bottom, and trying to say, okay, well, what part needs what? The psychiatrist doesn't necessarily need to be prescribing drugs, irrespective of what the psychologist is doing, and sometimes they're at cross purposes, right? So, then you get a system like we have right now, which is who's going to win, the medical profession or the psychological profession, the therapeutic profession. And I mean, obviously, the medical profession thinks it's therapeutic. And obviously the psychological profession does too. So it's kind of a galling situation right now. And of course it's, if you're not kind of in that milieu, it's probably really hard as a lay person to figure out what to do. Well, my doctor says one thing, but my psychologist says another. And, my psychologist says that I should not be medicalizing myself, but yet everything that's been done for the last 3 years of my therapeutic intervention has told me a lot about the dynamics of my life, but I still don't have my desire.
Mm.
And, somebody like that probably has not a neurochemical imbalance, but a brain that has become, through many months, if not years, of having low desire, a brain that has become, through its own plasticity and flexibility, now used to having low sexual desire. And so you need to, it's like a car with a bad battery. You need to jumpstart it.
You can get used to depression too, is what they're finding.
Sure.
Right? Any of these
Sure.
things. Mm-hmm.
Oh, the brain is great at doing that. The brain is great at acclimating to the circumstance. I mean, this is why we are able as a species to survive horrible things, horrible atrocities, prison camps, wars, the murder of your family in front of your face. And people survive. And they do so because their brain gets used to being in a certain way or being in a certain circumstance and knowing how to adjust to that circumstance. I mean, other animals have the same ability. You take cats, for example, in the Colosseum in Rome. There's a huge population of feral cats because people get the cat and they say, "Oh, it was beautiful. It was really cute as a kitten, but I don't like it as an adult." So they just throw it into the Colosseum. Well, these cats are feral, and researchers have actually gone in, taken the feral cats out, put them back in a home, and within about 48 hours, the feral cats become utterly, completely domesticated. And then a month later, they put them back into the Colosseum. They tag them so they know which one's which. Put them back in the Colosseum. It takes about 48 hours, and they become feral again and pack animals. And then they do the same thing. And of course, the time it takes to acclimate from from being feral to being domesticated gets less and less and less. So they sensitize. That shows you that extreme flexibility. So it takes longer to relearn how to do something that you've forgotten how to do. But not as long as it took the first time to learn how to do it. It just takes some time and some nurturing. So you want the psychologist. And a lot of people in the medical profession want the psychologist. But it's almost like the psychologists are saying, no, we know better than you do. And so, we're unfortunately in a situation now that doesn't really serve women or men for that matter, or serve their sexual needs all that well. I think we need a more holistic approach.
Well, I totally agree with you. So let's get into this idea of what denotes a diagnosis. I think you said something earlier along the lines of if you're having a crappy relationship, your desire is going to probably be affected by that.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's probably not one of these criteria. So what's the difference between like a low libido situation versus having a diagnostic?
Right. So, in the DSM, to get the diagnosis, you have to have had the low desire for a certain amount of time. It has to occur within between 75 and 100% of your sexual interactions. And by some time, I mean like 6 months or more. It has to occur irrespective of attempts by your partner and by you to, go get some therapeutic intervention. The criteria are very, very tight. And again, the tighter the criteria, the fewer people will actually meet it. Of course, you can go the other way, kind of like we were talking about with addiction. If addiction is you wanting anything, then everything is an addiction, and then everybody's an addict. And what good does that do, right? So, obviously, there's a balance between those two. Either everyone has it and everything means it, or nobody could possibly have it because the diagnostic criteria are way too narrow. So, what has been, I think, among the features of HSDD, that you would have it if you manifest like any of the following, like reduced or absent spontaneous desire, lack of motivation for sexual activity. There could be like reduced or absent even responsive desire to erotic cues and stimulation, which you could very easily look at, in an office just by doing eye tracking and looking at erotic material, like an inability to maintain desire through sexual activity. So, for example, you're not present in the moment. Loss of thoughts and fantasies, which has always been a main hallmark of it, and loss of a desire to initiate or participate in sexual activity. And so you just don't find yourself engaging in flirtation, engaging in the behaviors that you always engaged in. Or maybe you even find yourself avoiding situations that could lead to sexual activity, and it is not secondary, for example, to having vaginismus. Because obviously women are going to, if they have vaginismus or painful entry, they're going to avoid having sex. And they're going to perhaps even avoid situations that would get sexual because somebody's going to want to intromit, right? So, in addition, I think
meaning that's a very separate issue.
Right. And that would not be a desire disorder. That would be a sexual pain disorder, or even just a pain disorder for that matter. But then there has to be another criterion, which is that it bothers you in some way to have that. So it has to be clinically significant personal or interpersonal concern and distress. That it can include being frustrated, can include feelings of incompetence or loss or sadness, worry, grief, those kinds of things. And of course, the impact can be mild, moderate, or severe, and it can be lifelong or situational.
How is this different from, for example, all the things that we hear about asexual orientation?
Well, the asexuals are a real interesting group because this would be for all kinds of sexual activity, right? Not just sexual intercourse, but masturbation as well. The asexuals, by and large, almost all masturbate. Lori Brotto published some beautiful data on very politically motivated asexuals in Vancouver. Many of them masturbate. And they either masturbate straight porn or gay porn. But what's interesting about them is that they almost have Bill Clinton's definition of what involves, sexual relations, i.e., intercourse. Right? So
they're not interested in interrelational intercourse with another person.
That's right. And in fact, many of them are, score really high on introverted temperament. Are they truly asexual? Can you say somebody's asexual if they masturbate? Or are they asexual in the sense that the sexual part means interacting with another human being and having sex with that person. Right? I mean, there may be, I'm sure there are some who truly do not think about sex at all. They don't masturbate, they don't touch themselves, they don't do anything. And, that could be a very interesting population. But by and large, the people who call themselves asexual are doing quite a bit of masturbating, but they're simply not interacting in real time and real space, as opposed to virtual space, with another human being.
Do you know the percentage by chance of that?
Well, I think in Lori's study it was well over 90%.
Oh wow. Okay.
Oh yeah. So they're not interacting. So sexual intercourse with another person, something intromissive with another person, doesn't happen. But they masturbate, and they masturbate to gratification.
Okay.
Right? It's not that they seem to have a problem. Although, I mean, it'd be really interesting to see if that's true. We have data, normative data, for example, in heterosexual men for intravaginal ejaculation latency. And in fact, a colleague of mine in Europe, Marcel Waldinger, using a stopwatch method, has managed to get over 100,000 men the world over. And he's got these norms, which is kind of sad in a way because the mode is between 3 to 5 minutes, which I find kind of weird. I mean, 3 to 5 minutes is, I think, not enough time for anyone to suspend disbelief. And if you're a woman trying to get into it, 3 to 5 minutes might be sort of the point at which you begin to kind of think about maybe getting into it. You'd like it a bit longer. But that's the mode. It doesn't mean that all men are there. Some men are essentially premature or rapid, and others are delayed. And the delay can sometimes be really good unless it's delayed to the point of not, being anorgasmic. But 3 to 5 minutes. Okay, so masturbation. What's the ejaculation latency of men who masturbate? Well, here's one of those big questions that you think would have been answered. It's not even answered in Kinsey. It's not answered by anybody. Nobody's ever done the study. And it's one of those things that you think, what? Like, really? I mean, there's so much for grad students to do to try to make up for lost time and lost data in terms of things that people have just never asked. But I would love to know what the normative population that masturbates, what kind of timing it takes to achieve an ejaculation or an orgasm from the time they get a full erection and start. I'd love to know if in the asexuals it takes longer. Or if it's way more rapid, or what. I mean, I really don't know, and I don't even know what to hypothesize. It's one of those things where, you're like, you're sort of like Columbus. You think you're going to China, but you actually end up in North America. So you just got to take the data from whence it comes and kind of go out and do some exploratory analyses. But we really don't have good data on the asexuals. But it's pretty clear that they have a desire to masturbate. So in my mind, they still kind of have sexual desire, even though they don't have sex with another human being.
Okay, and then just to back up a little bit to explain the 3 to 5 minute intravaginal. So you're saying that when men enter the vaginal cavity, the mode of those statistics, meaning that doesn't mean the average,
right?
Is that it would take 3 to 5 minutes to ejaculate within the time that they entered the vaginal cavity. Is that, just to clarify?
That's right. That's right.
Right, which is why I think a lot of times sex therapists are telling men foreplay is so important.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Prior to
absolutely, because orgasms will happen faster with higher arousal, because arousal is activating the sympathetic nervous system, and orgasm is activated by sympathetic outflow. So if you're too parasympathetic and not enough sympathetic, you might need a spank on your buttock, you might need your hair pulled or nipples stimulated or whatever in order to have that orgasm, because you're just riding on that plateau. But again, it's a sympathetic response. So the more aroused someone is before they actually get down to brass tacks of intravaginal penetrative intercourse, the more likely it is that she's going to have an orgasm quickly. Or maybe have a whole set of orgasms quickly, or maybe have a whole big bang of orgasms that she's never had before because she's only ever had one. right? So I mean, it really depends on the woman and what she knows her pattern to be, and and everyone's a little bit different. So the other thing about orgasm too, when it rides on high arousal, it's always felt to be more intense. This first date, or not first date, but the first time a new couple actually finally has sex, the build up to that has been so intense that it can be over pretty quick. But of course, then they're going to move in together and things will get habitual. And once that happens, the arousal level might go down. So they're having it less and it may take much longer. And, that might be good for intimacy, at least in the short run. But it might kind of be a disaster because they're no longer working at it anymore.
Mm.
So I know a lot of my therapist friends in Montreal actually have a lot of couples have date nights. Not date nights where they go back home, but date nights where they send the kids to the grandparents and they actually go out, try to pick each other up, or they'll have some kind of a almost a script which they have to follow. And so he's got to go to the bar. She went to the bar an hour before. She's having all these guys buying her drinks, and then he goes and picks her up. He wins. He takes her to a hotel. Yes, you spend a little money, but oh my God, it's kind of like vacation sex, because it's riding on this amazing high arousal.
Right.
And the same thing works in rats. If they have to work for it, the male has to chase the female, and female rats love being chased. If they have a kind of a situation that allows that to happen, they will form a preference for that partner. They'll form a preference for the place that they have this in, almost in one trial. Again, because the arousal is so high, they're now attaching that right through that dopamine action to the external cues that predicted it.
And where does that fall as far as differences between men and women? It's always such a controversial topic, it seems like. So do men like being chased, or is it mainly more of a woman's trait?
It's interesting. It certainly is a female trait. Men like someone who is attentive, but being chased is almost being suffocated and not allowed to actually do what you need to do in order to show your interest. So, I mean, I think, we say men are from Mars and women from Venus. I mean, in fact, we're both from Earth, right? And as Earthlings, we have brains that are very similar to one another. I mean, it's not that there's a female brain, a male brain. There's a male pattern and there's a female pattern. But really what you get is kind of a interesting homogenation of the two. And everybody's a little bit different. So you may have, one part that's larger like a male phenotype, another part that's smaller like a female phenotype, or bigger like a female phenotype, and smaller like a male phenotype. And this kind of mosaic between male and female is something that everybody has. So even if you say, oh, there's Roger, he's a man's man. Yeah, well, okay. But if I actually look at his reaction, or I look at, the way where his language is lateralized to, or I mean, I can look at a whole host of things that are predictors of sex differences. And lo and behold, Roger's going to have some traits that are incredibly feminine and some traits that are incredibly masculine and some traits that are like in between the two. And, so nobody is one or the other. And I think that's part of life on Earth. Does Roger want to thread a needle? Come the zombie apocalypse, he may have to learn how to sew up his own clothes. Right? So he's going to have to learn some fine motor coordination. Maybe he took piano when he was a kid, so now he already has some fine motor coordination. Oh, but that's a female trait. Right? Guys are spatial. Females are fine motor. And you know what? That's such bunk. I mean, tailors can be men and cooks can be men, and women can play with big trucks and be airline pilots and be more spatial than anybody else. So the brain is a mosaic between male and female. It's not kind of locked in one position or the other. So, and I think the same thing happens sexually, that you're a product of what you know. You're a product of your experience.
Okay. So in general, however, though, we tend to have more of the male acting in the pursuer fashion for sexual arousal
Right.
of the woman. That may be more environmental than you're saying. I mean, if forced to, our brains might adapt to that.
I mean, I think the human brain probably could adapt to that, but we still have that as part of our evolutionary biology, right? That females are more choosy. Darwin said it. And so in order to be more choosy, because Women are investing a lot more resources, at least at first, and physical resources than men are.
Meaning
Being
when
choosy
they
is
get pregnant.
when they actually get pregnant.
Right.
Yeah, the amount of energy resources that have to be invested in that, and the fact that you can't run. If a lion's going to run after you to eat you, the lion's getting 2 for 1, and you can't run very fast, right? I mean, you may fight to the death, but you still can't run very fast. So, men, I mean, sperm is cheap, very cheap. Eggs are not. And we don't have a finite amount of sperm, whereas women have a finite number of eggs. So even on that basis, it's to be more choosy means that you are the one who needs to be shown. I mean, you as a female mammal are the one that needs female vertebrate are the one that needs to be shown that the male is a good reproductive interest. And the question is, well, is it all just about him being big and having what they call big epigamic characteristics? Here's my car, my stair equipment. Want to meet with me? Or is it also about who does her the best? Because honestly, all your friends can say, oh my God, he's a dream. And as far as you're concerned, you're not all that attracted. You're attracted to that other guy who's kind of short and whatever, but oh my God, he makes you laugh and he gives you the best orgasms ever. And he cuddles, he doesn't run away, he puts the toilet seat down. I mean, there's like a million things that could attract you to him. And your friends are like, but how could you be attracted to him? He doesn't have nearly as much money as the other guy has. And the other guy's tall and handsome and this and that. And you don't find him tall and handsome. And there's nothing wrong with you. You just are part of what makes the diversity of the recombination of your DNA and his DNA produce a kid who's got a way better chance of surviving. Right? Because you chose him. And you're much more likely to get pregnant too, because you're doing it with somebody you're interested in as opposed to somebody you're not.
Yeah, that's lovely, actually. It's very romantic. Science
I know. And that's, and that's kind of the rocket science of all this. It's like, yeah, romance, even guys like romance. It's not just all about getting off. It's also about what happens afterwards. I mean, how many guys find themselves in a hookup situation nowadays who, they really want to cuddle? Oh my God, I really like this girl. Yeah, but it's a hookup. And she doesn't necessarily like you, so she kicks you out of bed and tells you it's 2 o'clock, you got to go because I got to get up in the morning. And you're like, but, and you're just left acting like a motorboat. But, because you want to cuddle and she doesn't. I'm glad in a way that women are able to express that because, of course, that means they're in much more control of their sexuality. But they're also going to hit the brick wall when it comes. They're going to find a guy they want to cuddle with. And if he wants to cuddle back, oh my God. Now you know something you didn't know before. You know that sex and love can actually go together.
Isn't that lovely? Right.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.